There is a saying among the border stations, whispered by human contractors who took jobs no one else wanted: the Empire never notices you until the moment you become useful, and even then, it mistakes usefulness for accident. Elis Marrow had heard that saying 100 times before he ever set foot on the palace station of Threnn Vosk. He had never quite believed it. Now, kneeling on cold obsidian floor with 2 guards gripping his arms hard enough to bruise, a rifle-shaped weapon hovering an inch from the back of his skull, he was starting to think the saying had been generous. He had come to the throne room the way he came everywhere on this station, quietly. Through a maintenance shaft nobody had checked in decades, past a coolant junction that hadn't been serviced since before he was born, into a crawl space that ran directly beneath the dais, where the monarch of the Threnn Vosk dominion held court. He had a toolkit strapped across his back and grease under his fingernails, and precisely 0 authorization to be within 400 meters of the throne. He also had, tucked into his breast pocket, a small diagnostic slate that was still blinking a soft, satisfied green. The core was stable. He had done that. Nobody in the room seemed to care. 3 months earlier, Elis Marrow had been nobody in particular, which was exactly how he liked it. He worked in the lower maintenance decks of the station, 3 levels down from where anyone with a title ever bothered to look, fixing coolant lines and recalibrating gravity plating, and doing the 1,000 small invisible jobs that kept a 500-year-old imperial station from falling out of the sky. He was human, which in the Threnn Vosk dominion meant he ranked somewhere between decorative furniture and a mildly useful pack animal. He didn't mind. He had learned a long time ago that being underestimated was its own kind of armor. Nobody watched you closely if they had already decided you weren't worth watching. He had come to this station the way most humans came to imperial postings, through a labor contract signed by people higher up the chain than he would ever be, funneled into the deep maintenance decks where alien engineers didn't want to work because the smell of old coolant made their nose ridges ache, and the crawl spaces were too narrow for anyone with a Vulcan proper exoskeleton. Elis didn't mind the smell. He didn't mind the crawl spaces either. He had spent his whole life being smaller than the rooms he was allowed into, and somewhere along the way that had turned into an actual advantage. His crew chief was a Vantas named Cor Adeth, 400 pounds of chitinous plating and perpetual disdain, who assigned Elis to the worst jobs on the roster because it was easier than thinking about him. Elis didn't mind that either. The worst jobs on the roster were, without exception, the most interesting ones. Broken systems told stories. Nobody else on the crew seemed to want to listen. It was on one of those worst jobs 3 months into his posting that Elis found the crack in the wall. He had been sent to clear a blocked coolant line 2 levels below the throne room, a job so far beneath anyone's notice that his requisition slip had been stamped and forgotten within the hour. While tracing the blockage, he had found a service hatch behind a rack of ancient piping, warped shut with age. The imperial seal on it so old the metal had gone the color of a bruise. Curiosity, which had gotten Elis into more trouble over the years than any single other trait, made him pry it open. Behind the hatch was a chamber the size of a small house, and in the center of that chamber, humming beneath a lattice of dead diagnostic lights, was the oldest, largest power core Elis had ever laid eyes on. He had read about it, of course. Everyone on the station had, in the vague way people absorb legends they don't expect to matter to them. The Vosk Hearthstone, they called it. The ancient reactor buried beneath the throne itself, installed by the Empire's founding dynasty and never once fully understood by anyone who came after. 3 generations of royal engineers had tried and failed to repair its slow, creeping decay. The current monarch's own grandfather had reportedly executed 2 chief engineers for their failure to even diagnose the problem, let alone fix it. It was, by imperial reputation, unfixable, a relic too old and too strange for modern hands. Elis had looked at it for a long moment, listened to its uneven, arrhythmic hum, and felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. Interest. He hadn't touched it that first day. He'd gone back to his coolant line, filed his report, and said nothing to Cor Edith or anyone else about what he'd found. But that night, lying in his narrow bunk in the maintenance dormitory, he found himself sketching the shape of the core's containment lattice from memory, the way the primary coils spiraled in a pattern he didn't recognize from any imperial schematic he'd ever studied. It wasn't Imperial technology at all, he realized. Not originally. The Empire had built its throne on top of something older, something they had found and never fully understood, and then spent 5 centuries patching around the parts they couldn't explain. Elis had spent his whole life fixing things other people had given up on. It was, if he was honest with himself, the only thing that had ever made him feel like he mattered. He thought about his father, a mechanic on a farming colony that had failed 2 harvests running, working himself into an early grave trying to keep second-hand equipment alive, because the alternative was watching people starve. He thought about the years after, drifting from posting to posting, patching machines nobody else wanted to touch, because it turned out the grief was a lot easier to carry when your hands were busy. He went back to the chamber the next night, and the night after that. He never touched the reactor. Not directly, not at first. He mapped it instead, spending stolen hours running passive diagnostics, tracing power flows, with equipment he'd built himself from spare parts nobody would miss, learning the core's rhythms the way you'd learn the breathing of someone sick, someone you were trying to understand well enough to help. It took him 6 weeks just to understand what was wrong. The Heartstone wasn't failing because of age. Not really. It was failing because 5 centuries of royal engineers had been treating the wrong symptom, patching containment fields that didn't need patching, rerouting power flows that were never broken to begin with, while the actual fracture, a hairline stress crack in the primary resonance chamber, had been quietly widening beneath their notice the entire time. Every fix they'd applied over the generations had actually made the imbalance worse, propping up a structure that was slowly torquing itself apart from the inside. Nobody had found it because nobody had thought to look at the problem from below. They had all approached it as royal engineers, from positions of authority, assuming the fault must lie somewhere grand and complicated. Elis approached it the way he approached every broken thing in his life, from the bottom up, on his knees, hands first. It took him another 4 weeks of careful, patient, illegal work to actually fix it. He built his own tools for the job, adapting scavenged parts, because requisitioning anything that might explain what he was doing was out of the question. He worked in stolen hours, always during the deep cycle maintenance windows when the palace guard rotation thinned and the throne room above sat empty and dark. He learned to move through the crawl space beneath a dais without making a sound, learned the exact rhythm of the guard patrols, learned which sensors were decorative and which ones actually worked. He told no one, not Core Edith, not the handful of other humans on his crew, not even the quiet, kind woman 2 bunks down who sometimes shared her rations with him when his own ran short. It wasn't paranoia exactly, it was simpler than that. He had learned a long time ago that the things you loved doing were often the things other people would take from you. The moment they realized you were good at them, better to finish the work first, better to let it stand on its own. The night he finally sealed the resonance chamber crack, 3 months to the day after he'd first pried open that rusted hatch, the Heartstone's uneven hum smoothed out into something steady and low and almost musical. Elis sat in the crawl space in the dark, sweat-soaked and exhausted, and listened to 500 years of Imperial failure quietly correct itself under his hands. And he felt for the first time since his father's funeral something that might have been peace. He should have left it there. He should have packed up his tools, sealed the hatch, and gone back to his bunk and let the Empire figure out on its own, eventually, that its ancient reactor had stopped dying. Instead, he stayed to run one final diagnostic, just to be sure the seal would hold under full load. And that was when the guard rotation changed early, without warning, because the monarch had called an unscheduled morning court session and Elis Marrow found himself crawling out from beneath the throne room dais directly into the boots of 2 Threnn Vosk royal guards, 30 seconds before the monarch himself walked in. The throne room of Threnn Vosk Dominion was built to make visitors feel small, and it succeeded admirably even on people who had spent the last 3 months feeling perfectly comfortable in spaces built for creatures a third their size. The ceiling rose 80 feet overhead, ribbed with dark support struts that curved like the ribs of some impossible beast. Banners hung between them, deep imperial purple, edged in gold, each one marking a conquest or a dynasty or a treaty that had gone the Empire's way. The floor was polished obsidian, veined faintly with the same strange energy that ran through the heartstone below, though Elis suspected he was the only person in the room who understood why. At the far end, on a dais that rose in 7 wide steps, sat the throne itself, and on the throne sat Vosk Kadith Ren, the reigning monarch of the Thren Vosk dominion, a being 9 feet tall with skin the color of tarnished bronze and eyes like twin embers set deep beneath a heavy brow. He wore his crown, of course an ancient thing of interlocking metal bands that Elis recognized, with a jolt, as being wired directly into the same energy network as the core below. The crown was a display piece and a diagnostic feed all at once, and it had, until recently, been flickering with warning patterns for years. It was steady now. Elis could see the faint, even pulse of light in its bands from across the room. He wondered if anyone else had noticed yet. "Explain," said the monarch, and his voice was the kind of low that didn't need volume to fill a room. "Why a human maintenance worker was found crawling out from beneath my throne 30 seconds before I entered it." The guards yanked Elis upright. His knees protested. He'd been in that crawl space for 6 hours. "Speak," said one of the guards. A Vanta's captain whose name Elis didn't know, pressing the barrel of his sidearm harder against the base of his skull. "You are addressing His Radiance, sovereign of the Vosk dominion, warden of the Ember Throne." Elis considered his options, which were few and none of them good. He could plead ignorance, claim he'd gotten lost, hope the sheer implausibility of that excuse might buy him a quick execution instead of a slow one. He could stay silent and let them assume the worst, which in an imperial court usually meant assassination, sabotage, or some combination of the two that ended with his head on a spike outside the docking bay. Or he could tell the truth and hope that the truth, for once in his life, was strange enough to be believed. "I was fixing the reactor," he said. "One." The words landed in the throne room like a dropped tool in a silent workshop, small and sharp and entirely out of place. For a moment nobody moved. Then the Vanta's captain laughed, a short, ugly bark of a sound. "The reactor," the captain repeated. "The Heartstone. The Vosk Heartstone, which royal engineers have failed to repair for 3 generations, which His Radiance's own grandfather condemned 2 chief engineers over. You are telling this court that a maintenance grunt from the lower decks fixed it alone, without authorization, without tools befitting the work, without so much as a requisition order." "I built my own tools," Elis said. "The requisition order would have gotten flagged, and then someone with more rank and less patience would have taken over the job and made it worse, the way it's been made worse for 500 years. So, I didn't file one." The captain's grip on his sidearm tightened. "You admit to trespass in the sovereign's private chamber sabotage of state infrastructure, unauthorized modification of protected imperial technology." "I admit to fixing something that was broken," Elis said, and he was surprised by how calm his own voice sounded even to himself. Somewhere in the last 3 months, in all those quiet hours beneath the dais with his hands full of ancient wiring, he had stopped being afraid of consequences in the way he used to be. There was something almost freeing about having already done the hardest part. Whatever happened now, the core was fixed. Nobody could take that back. "If you want to arrest me for that, you're welcome to. But you might want to check the diagnostics on that crown first." The monarch's ember eyes flicked for the first time toward the crown resting on his own head, as though he could somehow inspect it by simply willing himself to notice it. "Explain, Vosk Kadith," Ren said again, and this time there was something different underneath the word. Not quite curiosity. Not yet. But the first crack in the certainty that had been sitting on his face since Elis had been dragged before him. Elis Marrow had spent his entire working life being ignored by people who assumed his hands were only good for menial labor, and in a strange way that had prepared him perfectly for this exact moment, kneeling on an obsidian floor with a gun to his skull. Being asked by an alien king to explain 5 centuries of engineering failure in whatever time he had left before someone decided to shoot him anyway, he decided to just answer the question. "The Heartstone's problem was never in the containment fields," he said. "Every royal engineer for the last 3 generations treated it like a containment problem, because that's where the warning lights are. That's where the instability shows up on the surface readings. So they kept reinforcing the containment lattice, rerouting power around it, adding redundancy after redundancy. Every single fix made the surface symptoms look better for a while. And every single fix made the actual problem worse. And what, the monarch said slowly, was the actual problem? A stress fracture in the primary resonance chamber, Elis said. Small, old, older than any of the fixes anyone's tried. It's been widening for a long time, probably since before your grandfather's reign, and every patch job on the containment lattice put more pressure on it instead of less, because nobody ever looked past the symptom to find where the actual damage was. It's not imperial technology, by the way, not originally. Whatever built that core, your ancestors found it, not made it, and they never fully understood how it worked, which is probably why nobody's been able to fix it properly in 500 years. You've all been trying to repair a language you don't speak. The silence that followed was long enough that Elis could hear his own pulse in his ears. You crawled beneath my throne, the monarch said, for 3 months alone, and diagnosed a fault that killed 2 of my grandfather's chief engineers by their failure to find it. I didn't kill anyone, Elis said. I found the crack, sealed the resonance chamber, and rebalanced the flow so the containment lattice isn't fighting itself anymore. It should hold for at least another century, probably longer if somebody actually maintains it properly, instead of panic patching it every time a light turns red. And you did this, the monarch said, without permission, without oversight, without so much as informing a single member of my court. Yes, Elis said, because there was no version of that sentence that sounded better with a lie attached to it. The captain's sidearm dug harder into the back of Elis's skull, and Elis felt a small, cold certainty settle into his chest that he had perhaps miscalculated how much his honesty would be worth in a room built entirely around imperial hierarchy and the punishment of those who stepped outside their assigned place. Your Radiance, the captain said, the penalty for unauthorized modification of the Heartstone is death. The law does not distinguish between sabotage and repair. It distinguishes only between authorized and unauthorized. This human has confessed to the latter. I request permission to carry out sentence immediately. Elis closed his eyes. Not out of fear exactly, more out of a strange, tired sort of acceptance, the same feeling he'd had standing at his father's grave, watching dirt fall onto a coffin built from parts of a tractor that had finally, mercifully, stopped needing to be fixed. He had done the work. Whatever happened to him now didn't change, that the work had been done and done well, and that felt, in some quiet corner of his mind, like enough. Wait, the monarch said. The single word cracked through the throne room with more force than any shout could have managed. The captain froze, sidearm still pressed to the back of Elis's skull, but he did not fire. Vos Cadith Ren rose from his throne. He was standing, even more imposing than he had been seated, 9 feet of bronze-skinned authority, moving down the 7 wide steps of the dais with unhurried, deliberate strides. Elis watched him approach through the corner of his vision, heart hammering despite the strange calm he'd managed to hold on to through the interrogation, and thought, with the small dark humor of a man who had genuinely run out of better options, that at least he'd get a good look at the throne room before he died. The monarch stopped directly in front of him. Up close, his ember eyes were even more striking. Twin points of bank fire set beneath a brow ridge carved with faint ceremonial scarring. The marks of a coronation ritual Elis had read about once in an idle moment and never expected to see this close. Bring the diagnostic feed, the monarch said, not looking away from Elis. A functionary Elis hadn't even noticed. Some minor court official stationed near the dais scrambled to obey, pulling up a floating display that projected the crown's live telemetry feed into the air between them. The monarch glanced at it for the first time in what Elis suspected was months, maybe longer. The kind of habitual neglect that comes from staring at bad news for so long you stop expecting it to change. The feed showed steady green light across every metric. Stable output. Balanced containment. No warning flags anywhere on the display. The monarch stared at it for a long moment. This has been failing, he said quietly, since before I was crowned. My father spent the last decade of his reign obsessed with it. He believed the empire itself would crumble when the Heartstone finally died, that the throne's authority was tied to its power in ways no one fully understood. He executed engineers over it. He nearly went to war with a neighboring system over a rumor that they possessed better reactor technology that might save it. It has been the single most persistent crisis of this dynasty for 3 generations. He looked down at Elis, kneeling on the obsidian floor, with a gun still pressed to his skull, and something in his expression shifted, the fire in his eyes banking down into something more, considering. "And you fixed it," the monarch said, "in 3 months alone, with tools you built yourself. Without telling a single soul, someone would have stopped me if I told them," Elis said, "or taken credit for it before I finished, or made it worse trying to help. I've seen what happens when people with authority and no patience get involved in a job that needs neither of those things. I figured it was safer to just finish it first and explain later." "You are aware," the monarch said slowly, "that later in this instance was the moment my guards caught you crawling out from beneath my throne with no explanation and every appearance of sabotage." "I'm aware," Elis said. "It wasn't my best planned exit." Something flickered across the monarch's face that Elis, if he'd been in a room with slightly less imminent lethal danger, might have called the ghost of a laugh. "Captain," the monarch said without turning his head, "lower your weapon." The captain hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, the kind of hesitation that came from a lifetime of imperial law drilled into a soldier's bones, telling him that unauthorized modification meant death. No exceptions, no distinctions. But an order from the throne was an order from the throne, and after that fractional pause, the pressure at the back of Elis's skull disappeared. Elis let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for the better part of the last 5 minutes. "Stand him up," the monarch said. The 2 guards who had dragged him in hauled Elis back onto his feet, though with considerably less roughness than before. His knees ached, his shoulders ached. Every muscle in his back ached from 6 hours, crouched in a crawlspace built for creatures with a very different spine than his own. He stood as straight as he could manage anyway, because something told him that whatever happened next, he wanted to face it standing, not slumped. "You understand," the monarch said, circling him slowly now, the way a buyer might circle a piece of equipment he was considering purchasing, "that what you have described is, by every metric this court recognizes, impossible. The Heartstone is not merely old technology. It predates the founding of this dynasty. It predates, according to some scholars, the dynasty that came before mine. Royal engineers who dedicate their entire lives to its study, who train for decades in its specific architecture, have failed to even properly diagnose its decline. And you are telling me a maintenance worker from the lower decks, with no formal engineering education that this court is aware of, solved it in 3 months using equipment he built from scavenged parts. And I didn't need a formal education to listen to what was actually wrong with it," Elis said. "I needed patience and time nobody was watching too closely, and a willingness to start from underneath instead of assuming the answer had to be complicated because the problem looked complicated. Most things that break for simple reasons. People just don't like simple answers when they've spent generations building complicated ones." The monarch stopped circling. He studied Elis for a long moment, ember eyes tracing over him with an intensity that made Elis distinctly aware of how strange this whole situation was, how thoroughly it violated every rule he understood about how empires and their monarchs were supposed to treat people who looked like him. "What is your name?" the monarch said. "Elis Marrow, your radiance." "Elis Marrow," the monarch repeated, testing the shape of it. "And you have been in my service, on this station, for how long?" 3 months, your radiance. Lower maintenance decks. Coolant systems and gravity plating. Mostly. 3 months, the monarch said, and in that time you accomplished what 3 generations of royal engineers, men and women with titles and lineages and formal education stretching back centuries, could not. He turned to the functionary who had brought the diagnostic feed. "Pull his service record now." The functionary complied, and a second display flickered into the air, scrolling through the unremarkable, dutiful history of a man who had spent his entire career fixing things nobody else wanted to touch. Broken coolant lines, failing gravity plates. A minor commendation, buried 3 pages down, for restoring emergency power to a habitation block during a grid failure that had left 200 workers without heat for 6 hours. Resolved in under 90 minutes by a maintenance worker who had, according to the report, used unconventional methods and unauthorized equipment modifications. The monarch read the commendation twice. Unconventional methods, he murmured. Unauthorized equipment modifications. It appears. This is something of a pattern with you, Elis Marrow. I fix what's broken, Elis said. I don't always wait for permission to do it, because permission usually takes longer than the actual fixing does, and by the time it arrives, whatever's broken has usually gotten worse. I know that's not how things are supposed to work here. I know I broke about a dozen laws crawling around under your throne for 3 months. I'm not asking you to pretend I didn't. I'm just telling you why I did it, because it's the truth, and because the core's fixed either way. And I figured you deserved a straight answer more than a good excuse. For a long moment, the monarch said nothing at all. The throne room held its silence, 80 feet of dark ceiling and ancient banners, and the faint, steady hum of a reactor that had, for the first time in 3 generations, stopped dying beneath the floor. Then, Vos Kadith Wren turned to the captain who had, moments before, been prepared to execute a man on the spot for the crime of fixing something no one else could fix. Release the charges, the monarch said. All of them. Your Radiance, the captain began, and there was real distress in his voice now, the distress of a soldier watching the foundations of his understanding shift beneath his feet. The law regarding unauthorized modification of the Heartstone specifically does not distinguish. Then, the law will be amended, the monarch said, which somehow made the words land harder than if he had shouted them. I am the sovereign of the Vosk Dominion. I do not require a law written 5 centuries ago by ancestors who never once solved this problem to tell me how to treat the one person who did. The captain fell silent. Around the throne room, the assembled court, the functionaries, and guards and minor officials who had gathered for the unscheduled morning session stood in a kind of stunned quiet that Elis suspected was rare in a room this formal. Elis Marrow, the monarch said, turning back to him, you have solved a crisis that has defined 3 generations of my family's rule. You have done so with skill, with patience, and with an honesty that, I will admit, I did not expect from someone I was told to execute less than 10 minutes ago. I try to be efficient about these things, Elis said, and heard, distantly, a few scattered sounds around the room that might have been suppressed laughter, quickly stifled. The monarch's expression, for the first time since he had descended the dais, softened into something that was almost, though not quite, a smile. I am offering you a position, he said, permanent. Chief Royal Engineer of the Vosk Dominion, with full authority over the maintenance and continued care of the Heartstone and over any other imperial technology this court has failed to properly understand. You will answer directly to the throne. You will have whatever resources you require, whatever tools you deem necessary, and whatever authority you need to do the work without waiting on permission that arrives too late to matter. Elis stood very still, processing the sheer distance between where he had started this morning, crouched in a crawl space, with sweat cooling on his skin, and where he was standing now. Your Radiance, he said carefully. With respect, I'm a human maintenance worker from the lower decks. Your court has a whole hierarchy built around who's allowed to hold what title, and I don't imagine most of the people in this room are going to be thrilled about a human standing where I'd be standing. No, the monarch agreed. They will not be thrilled. Several of them will likely be furious. Some of them will attempt in ways subtle and otherwise to see you removed from the position within the year. He paused. I find that I have very little patience left for the opinions of people who spent 3 generations failing to solve a problem that a maintenance worker fixed alone in secret using tools he built with his own hands, because he correctly assumed that the people with the proper authority to help him would only make things worse. He let that sit in the room for a moment. You said something a moment ago, the monarch continued, that I intend to remember. You said most things that break for simple reasons. And people don't like simple answers because they've spent generations building complicated ones. I have sat on this throne for 6 years, Elis Marrow, surrounded by advisors who have built entire careers out of complicated answers to simple problems, because complicated answers are easier to justify a salary around than simple ones. I find that I am tired of it. I find that I would rather have one person who tells me the truth plainly than a court full of people who tell me what I want to hear at great and ceremonious length. Elis thought about his father dying slowly over failed harvests and second-hand machinery, doing the same quiet, patient, thankless work for people who never once thought to offer him anything more than his wages. He thought about Edith, who had assigned him the worst jobs on the roster because it was easier than looking at him. He thought about 3 months spent in the dark beneath an ancient throne, alone doing work that mattered more than anything he'd been trusted with in his entire life, purely because nobody was watching closely enough to stop him. "I'll take the position," Elis said, "on one condition." The captain, still visibly rattled by the morning's turn of events, made a small, strangled sound that suggested negotiating conditions with the sovereign of the Vasca Dominion was not something junior maintenance workers were generally permitted to do. The monarch, for his part, looked almost pleased. "Name it," he said. "There's a woman on my crew," Elis said. "2 bunks down from mine, Talabricks. She spent 4 years in the lower decks doing work twice as skilled as what she's rated for, because nobody ever bothered to check her file past the line that says human. If I'm taking a position with authority to hire whoever I judge fit for the work, I want that authority to actually mean something. Starting with her." The monarch studied him for a long moment, and something in his ember eyes shifted again, some final recalibration of exactly what kind of person he had dragged, at gunpoint, out from beneath his own throne that morning. "Granted," he said. "And Elis Marrow, bring me a list. Every worker on this station whose file you believe has been misjudged, the way yours nearly was. I would like to know exactly how much talent this court has been standing on top of without ever bothering to look down." Elis felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been wound tight for a very long time. Longer than the 3 months he'd spent under that throne, longer even than the years since his father's funeral. It wasn't triumph, exactly. It was quieter than that. It felt more like the moment a broken machine finally settled into its proper rhythm, the moment the wrongness in the hum finally resolved into something steady. "I'll have it to you by the end of the week, Your Radiance," he said. The monarch nodded once, turned, and began the walk back up the 7 wide steps to his throne, the crown on his head pulsing with its slow, steady, healthy light, the first honest heartbeat that ancient Reactor had managed in 3 generations. At the top of the steps he paused, looked back down at the small human figure standing amid a throne room that had nearly executed him an hour before. "For what it is worth, Voss," Catherine said, "you have my gratitude, not merely as your sovereign. As the man who has spent 6 years listening to that reactor die beneath his own feet, wondering if he would be the last of his line to hear it. You gave me back a future I had stopped expecting to have." Elis inclined his head, the closest thing to a formal bow his aching back could manage. "Just doing the job, Your Radiance," he said. "Somebody had to." The monarch settled back onto his throne, and the court, still visibly reeling, began the slow, awkward process of returning to whatever business had been scheduled before a maintenance worker had crawled out from beneath the dais and rewritten the terms of his own existence in the space of 20 minutes. Elis Marrow walked out of that throne room a different man than the one who had been dragged into it, though it would take the rest of the empire considerably longer to understand exactly how different. Within a year, 3 more human workers from the lower decks had been promoted into positions their files had never suggested they deserved, each one uncovered by a chief engineer who had made it his personal mission to check the work behind every misjudged name on every dismissed file. Within 2 years, the lower maintenance decks of Thren Vosk had become, unofficially, one of the most requested postings in the Dominion, staffed by people who understood, in a way the rest of the empire was only beginning to, that the most dangerous thing you could do to a competent person was assume they were beneath your notice. And, beneath the throne of the Vosk Dominion, the ancient reactor that had failed 3 generations of royal engineers hummed on, steady and even, tended now by a man who had learned, over a lifetime of fixing what everyone else had given up on, that the truest measure of skill was never the title attached to your name. It was whether the thing you touched still worked long after everyone stopped watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next tale of quiet competence proving louder than any crown. Let me know in the comments what you would have done in Elis's place, kneeling under that throne with a gun to your head and the truth as your only weapon. Until next time, keep your hands steady and your work honest.